The grand ballroom was a symphony of manufactured opulence, a cavernous space where light itself seemed to be a commodity purchased in bulk. 1,000 crystal teardrops of the central chandelier refracted and multiplied the glow, casting a shimmering, artificial daylight over the proceedings below. The air was a thick, layered perfume of expensive cigars, rare blossoms arranged in impossible sculptures, and the subtle, citrus-based colognes worn by men for whom cost was an afterthought. This was the annual Celestial Hope Charity Gala, and its primary celestial body, its sun around which all other planets of influence and aspiration helplessly orbited, was a young man named Khalid al-Fayed. Khalid, heir to an empire built on shipping oil and sheer, unadulterated will, stood near the center of the room, a glass of champagne held loosely in his fingers, its bubbles rising with a frantic energy that stood in stark contrast to his own profound, soul-deep boredom. He was, by any objective measure, a handsome man, with features carved as if from dark marble, but tonight they were set in a mask of weary indulgence. He was surrounded as always by a rotating constellation of acquaintances, sycophants, and business associates, all of whom offered the same polished compliments, the same laughter that was a fraction too loud at his mildest observations, the same hungry eyes that looked past him and saw only the reflection of his bank accounts. He had long ago grown accustomed to the hollow echo of this world, to the way every interaction felt like a transaction waiting to happen. A compliment on his suit was a preamble to a request for investment. A toast to his health was a silent prayer for his patronage. He moved through the gala like a ghost in his own life, the noise and color washing over him without leaving a mark. His father, the formidable Mr. Abbas, had insisted he attend, to be the face of the family's philanthropy, but Khalid felt less like a benefactor and more like the evening's prime exhibit, a trophy to be admired before the real business of social climbing began. It was in this state of detached ennui that his gaze, sweeping dismissively across the room, snagged on a point of quiet contrast. While the guests were a riot of jewel-toned silks and tailored black tie, she was a study in muted simplicity. A woman, one of the many event staff, her posture impossibly straight yet devoid of stiffness, moved with a fluid economic grace between the clusters of chattering guests. She held a silver tray of empty champagne flutes, her eyes downcast, her entire being focused on the simple task of retrieval and replenishment. There was a serenity to her, a silence that seemed to emanate from her very core, creating a small island of calm in the turbulent sea of noise. She was, in a word, unnoticeable to everyone but a man for whom the noticeable had become utterly tedious. A slow, cynical smile touched Khalid's lips. Here was something new. A different kind of game. He watched her for a full minute, tracking her path, noting the way she navigated the crowded space without ever quite touching anyone, a silent, graceful phantom. He turned to the ring of men surrounding him, a collection of sons of other wealthy families who looked to him for their cue for entertainment. "Look at that," he said, his voice a low drawl that immediately commanded their attention. "A dove among peacocks. She moves well, doesn't she? Like she hears music the rest of us cannot." His friends followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from curiosity to knowing smirks. They understood the tone. This was Khalid setting the stage for a spectacle. "I wonder," he mused, raising his voice just enough to draw the attention of nearby socialites, who pricked up their ears like elegant hounds sensing a new scent. "I wonder what it would take to make a quiet dove sing. Or better yet, dance." The idea, absurd and cruel, began to crystallize in his mind, fueled by champagne and the desperate need to feel something, anything beyond the crushing weight of his own privilege. He snapped his fingers, the sound sharp and imperious, cutting through the ambient hum of conversation. The woman, her name tag reading Leila, looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the chandelier's light for a moment before they settled on him, questioning but not fearful. She approached, her steps still carrying that innate, unconscious grace. "Sir? Can I assist you?" Her voice was low, polite, perfectly professional. Khalid looked her up and down, not with desire, but with the appraisal of a man considering a new acquisition. The chatter around them had died down. An audience was gathering, sensing a performance. "I was just telling my friends," Khalid began, his voice booming now, theatrical, ensuring everyone in their immediate vicinity could hear, "that you carry yourself with a certain rhythm. Tell me, girl, can you dance?" Layla's polite mask didn't slip, but a faint wariness entered her eyes. "I'm here to work, sir. Not to dance." "Everything is work if the price is right," Khalid retorted, a philosophy that had been proven true his entire life. He took a step closer, the scent of his expensive cologne a stark contrast to the clean, soapy smell of her. The humiliation was not just for her. It was a performance for his peers, a demonstration of his power to turn even the most mundane moment into his own personal theater. I have a proposition for you. A wager. He paused, letting the anticipation build. Dance for me. Right here. Right now. Dance the tango. A wave of titters swept through the crowd. Impress me, he jeered, the words dripping with condescension, and I'll make you the envy of every woman in this room. Dance tango, I'll marry you. The sentence hung in the air, grotesque and shocking in its arrogance. It wasn't a proposal, it was a punchline. The crowd erupted in laughter, a mix of genuine amusement and nervous tension. They looked from Khalid's smug, triumphant face to Leila's frozen, pale one. She had become the evening's unexpected entertainment. A servant girl offered a crown she could never legitimately win, for a prize she could never possibly want, all for the amusement of a man who believed the world existed solely for his diversion. The weight of their collective gaze, mocking and curious, pressed down on her, a physical force of isolation and shame in the midst of the glittering, crowded ballroom. The wave of laughter that followed Khalid's pronouncement was not a single sound but a layered, complex thing. It was the sharp, braying guffaw of his immediate companions, who saw only the brilliant audacity of the joke. It was the higher, more nervous tittering of the socialites, who were both appalled and enthralled by the sheer breach of decorum. And underpinning it all was the low, uncomfortable murmur of those few who sensed the profound cruelty of the moment but lacked the social capital or the courage to voice an objection. This cacophony washed over Leila, each note a tiny, stinging pellet against her skin. She stood perfectly still at the center of this storm of derision, the silver tray in her hands feeling suddenly not like a piece of servingware but an anchor, a heavy, cold weight tethering her to this humiliating reality. Her first instinct was a primal one: flight. To turn, to push through the crowd of grinning, expectant faces, to find the nearest service exit and vanish into the anonymous, forgiving darkness of the back corridors and kitchens. Her muscles tensed for the motion, a tremor running through her legs. But as her eyes darted towards the periphery of the circle that had formed around her, she saw the impossibility of it. The crowd had closed ranks not with malice, but with the simple gravitational pull of spectacle. They were an audience now, and she was the unwilling star of the show. To flee would be to invite more laughter, to be chased from the stage by a chorus of jeers. It would be a different kind of humiliation, but a humiliation nonetheless. Her second instinct was to refuse again, to stand on her dignity, to voice a protest that would shame him. She lifted her chin, a small act of defiance, and opened her mouth to speak. But the words died in her throat. What could she say? How dare you? He dared because he was Khalid al-Fayed, and his whims were the commands around which this entire world, this very gala, revolved. This is inappropriate? The rules of appropriateness were written by men like him, and could be rewritten on a whim. Any protest from her would be seen as part of the entertainment, a feisty retort from a serving girl that would only enhance the narrative he was crafting. He held all the power, and he had engineered this moment to demonstrate that very fact, not just to her but to everyone present. A strange, cold clarity began to descend upon her, freezing the panic, stilling the tremor in her hands. The heat of shame that had flushed her cheeks receded, replaced by a cool, focused calm. She saw the situation not from her own perspective, trapped and powerless, but from a higher vantage point. She saw Khalid not as a formidable billionaire, but as a petulant boy, bored and desperate for a reaction, any reaction. She saw the crowd not as a monolithic entity of judgment, but as a collection of sheep, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And in that moment she understood that the only power she had was the power of her own performance. He had demanded a dance. He had reduced the art form she loved, the passion that was her secret life, to a cheap party trick, a transaction. But he had, in his arrogance, handed her the tools to her own defense. He wanted a show. She would give him one. But it would not be the show he expected. It would not be a performance of seduction or supplication. It would not be a desperate gambit for his approval or his grotesque proposal. If he wanted to see the tango, she would show him the true tango. Not the sanitized ballroom version he probably imagined, but the raw, storytelling tango of the milongas her grandmother had taught her. A dance of passion, yes, but also of tragedy, of pride, of conflict, and of profound, soul-wrenching conversation. The laughter finally subsided, leaving an anticipatory silence. Khalid was still smirking, expecting either tears or a frantic, clumsy attempt to comply. He expected to win as he always did. Leila took a slow, deep breath, the air feeling sharp and clear in her lungs. She looked away from him, breaking the tense eye contact, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, she bent down and placed the heavy silver tray on the polished marble floor. It was a simple action, but it was final. It was her resignation. She was no longer a server. Then she straightened up and met his gaze once more. The wariness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a look of such deep, unsettling resolve that Khalid's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. The room held its breath. In a voice that was low, yet carried to every corner of the silent circle, she spoke. It was not the voice of a servant. It was the voice of an artist issuing a challenge. "I will dance," she said, each word measured and clear. "But not for your offer. Not for your money. Not for a ring." She paused, letting the refusal of his entire world sink in. "I will dance so that you will remember the weight of your words. I will dance so you understand what you have truly asked for." A profound, almost suffocating silence descended upon the grand ballroom. It was a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the very echoes of the previous laughter, leaving a vacuum of anticipation in its wake. All eyes were fixed on Leila, who stood isolated in a circle of opulent disbelief. She had issued her challenge, and now the moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then, from the string quartet stationed in the far corner, a single hesitant note from a violin quivered in the air. Was a question. The musician, sensing the shift in the room's energy, had taken a chance, offering the opening bars of a classic, melancholic tango. It was all the invitation Leila needed. She did not begin with a dramatic pose or a flamboyant gesture. Instead, she seemed to turn inward, her shoulders softening, her head tilting slightly as if listening to a voice only she could hear. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them, she was no longer Leila the server. She was a vessel for the music, for the story. Her first step was not a step at all, but a slow, deliberate drag of her foot across the polished marble, a soundless scrape that was more felt than heard, a line drawn in the sand between her world and his. Then the dance began. It was not the tango of Hollywood or of staged competitions. This was tango apalato, the dance of embrace, of connection, but she danced it alone, her arms cradling an invisible partner. Her movements were a language. She started with a story of pride. Her spine was a steel rod, her chin held high, her steps sharp, precise, and full of a noble, ancient dignity. She was a queen surveying her realm, each pivot and sweep of her leg a declaration of unassailable self-worth. She looked directly at Khalid as she did this, and the pride in her movement was a mirror held up to his own, but purer, untarnished by wealth or status, born of something deeper. The music swelled and her narrative shifted. The proud queen encountered a court jester. Her movements became sharper, more angular, almost mocking. A quick flick of her ankle, a sudden staccato tap of her heel, it was a perfect, silent imitation of his jeering tone. She mimed a crown being placed on her head, then laughed a silent, bitter laugh and tossed the imaginary crown away with a contemptuous flick of her wrist. She was acting out the absurdity of his proposition, reducing his billion-dollar offer to a cheap trinket, a joke in poor taste. A few uncomfortable shuffles moved through the crowd. The satire was too precise, too accurate to be ignored. And then the dance transformed again. The mockery fell away, replaced by a deep, aching loneliness. Her embrace with her invisible partner tightened, becoming less a dance and more a desperate clutch for comfort. Her movements slowed, becoming fluid and heavy with a sorrow that seemed to seep into the very air of the ballroom. She was no longer looking at Khalid, she was lost in her own world of feeling. She danced the loneliness of the outsider, the one who serves but is never seen. She danced the isolation of being valued for a utility, for a function, never for a soul. She arched backwards, a classic tango dip, but performed with such exquisite slowness and vulnerability that it looked less like a dramatic move and more like a soul yielding to a profound grief. She was showing him the human cost of his carelessness, the person behind the uniform he had so casually dismissed. The music began to build towards its climax, and with it Leila's dance found a new, fierce energy. It was a dance of reclamation. The sorrow was channeled into power. Her steps became faster, more complex, a breathtaking display of intricate gyros and boleos, spins and kicks, that were so perfectly executed they seemed both impossibly passionate and mathematically precise. She was a storm of controlled emotion, a testament to years of discipline and hidden passion. This was no longer a reflection of him. This was the unveiling of her true self. This was the artist, the champion her grandmother had trained, emerging not for his approval, but in defiance of his very gaze. She was proving that the talent he had tried to buy for a night was a lifetime's worth of dedication, a treasure he could never afford. As the final dramatic note of the music hung in the air, Leila struck her ending pose. It was not one of submission or appeal. It was one of absolute, final defiance. One arm was flung high above her head, fingers stretched towards the distant chandelier as if grasping for something true, while the other was wrapped protectively across her own heart. Her body was taut, every muscle defined, her chest heaving with the physical effort and the emotional expenditure. Her eyes were closed, and on her face was an expression of utter exhaustion and profound peace. She had said everything she needed to say. The silence that followed was no longer anticipatory. It was awestruck. It was reverent. It was the silence that follows a lightning strike, the air itself charged and changed. And in the center of that silence, Leila stood, utterly alone, and yet for the first time that evening, completely and unquestionably whole. The silence that followed the final note was a physical entity, thick and heavy, pressing down on the assembled guests with the weight of a shared, profound experience they had not asked for and were utterly unprepared to process. For a long moment no one moved. No one breathed. They were statues in a museum of their own making, frozen in the aftermath of a story that had been told not with words, but with the raw, unforgiving language of the body. The air, once perfumed with arrogance and frivolity, now felt scoured clean, charged with the lingering electricity of Leila's performance. All eyes remained glued to the woman at the center of the circle, her form still locked in that final, defiant pose, a silhouette of pure emotion carved against the glittering backdrop of the ballroom. Then a single, solitary sound broke the spell. It was not applause, not yet. It was the soft, almost apologetic click of a heel as Leila lowered her arm and settled her weight onto both feet. The movement was small, practical, and utterly devastating in its normality. It was the sound of a curtain closing, of a world being shut away. She did not look at the audience. She did not seek validation or praise. Her gaze was inward, her expression one of a person who has completed a difficult, necessary task and is now simply finished. Slowly, with a tiredness that seemed to emanate from her very bones, she turned away from Khalid. She did not grant him a glance of triumph or a look of scorn. To her, in that moment he had ceased to exist. He was part of the scenery, a prop in a play that was now over. Her movement triggered a wave of unease through the crowd. People shifted on their feet, suddenly aware of their own complicity, their own silent participation in the spectacle. They had been spectators at a crucifixion, and now the victim was walking away, leaving them alone with their guilt. Leila walked the few steps to where she had placed the silver tray. She did not hurry. Each step was measured, deliberate, a quiet reclaiming of her own space and time. She bent down, the simple black fabric of her server's dress stretching taut across her back, and picked it up. She held it in both hands not as a burden, but as an object that had now been rendered meaningless. She looked at it for a second, a final, quiet farewell to the job, to the identity, to the entire life that had just been publicly and irrevocably severed. Then she began to walk. She moved directly towards the crowd, and this time, it did not hold its ground. It parted for her like the Red Sea, a silent, respectful avenue opening up between the silks and suits. No one tried to stop her. No one offered a compliment. To speak would have been a desecration. They simply watched her pass, their faces a mosaic of shock, awe, and dawning shame. She moved through them, her head held with the same pride she had danced with moments before, her gaze fixed on the grand arched doorway that led to the service corridors, to the kitchens, to the outside world. She never broke her stride. She did not look back. She reached the doorway, a darker, plainer world visible beyond its frame. She paused for only a heartbeat on the threshold, a silhouette once more. And then she stepped through and was gone. The doorway stood empty, a void where a moment of stunning humanity had just vanished. It was only after she had disappeared that the spell truly broke for the audience. A wave of sound erupted, but it was not the coordinated applause of a performance well received. It was a confused, tumultuous babble of overlapping reactions, gasps of incredible, murmured questions of who was she, and low, self-conscious whispers among those who were just beginning to process the depth of Khalid's humiliation and their own role in it. They clapped, but the applause was scattered, hesitant, and quickly died out, as if they realized they were applauding for the wrong reasons, for a performance that had been a rebuke, not a gift. And in the center of it all stood Khalid al-Fayed. He had not moved a muscle since the dance began. His champagne flute was still held, forgotten, in his limp hand. The smirk was gone, wiped from his face as if by a brutal hand. His features were slack with a kind of stunned incomprehension. He was a man who had thrown a stone at a quiet pond expecting a satisfying splash, and had instead triggered a seismic event that had cracked the very ground beneath his feet. He was surrounded by noise, by people, by the trappings of his immense power, but he had never, in his entire life, felt more completely and utterly alone. The echo of her final steps, the image of her walking away without a backward glance, was a void inside him, a silence more deafening than any applause. He was left with nothing but the crushing, unbearable weight of his own empty words. The days that followed the Celestial Hope Gala were a strange and disorienting purgatory for Khalid al-Fayed. The opulent confines of his penthouse, which usually felt like a command center overlooking the world, now felt like a gilded cage. The silence was different. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of privilege, but a heavy, accusatory silence that seemed to vibrate with the memory of a single haunting melody. He found himself starting at the sound of his own staff moving through the rooms, their respectful quiet suddenly feeling like a judgment. The world had not changed, but his perception of it had been fundamentally, irrevocably cracked. He replayed the evening in his mind on a relentless loop, not the beginning with his arrogant proposition, but the end, the silent, devastating finality with which she had walked away from him, from all of it, without a single backward glance. That was the detail that haunted him most of all. He was used to being the center of attention, the sun in every solar system. To be so completely dismissed was an entirely new and deeply unsettling experience. He tried to bury the feeling, as he had buried every other discomfort in his life, beneath a frenzy of activity. He scheduled meetings, made impulsive bids on companies, hosted lavish, noisy parties at his home. But it was no use. The faces of his friends now seemed vacuous, their laughter hollow and irritating. Their conversations about mergers and acquisitions and superyachts felt like the chirping of insects. He had seen something real, something true and powerful and raw, and it had rendered his entire world of polished surfaces and calculated transactions utterly false. He realized with a dawning horror that the woman Leila had not been dancing for his approval. She had been performing an autopsy on his character, and she had left him on the table, exposed and dissected. This realization bred a desperate, obsessive need. It wasn't about finding her to apologize, not yet. It was about understanding what he had witnessed. He needed to put a name to the force that had so thoroughly dismantled him. He needed to classify it, to quantify it, to bring it into the realm of things he could comprehend and, therefore, control. He summoned his personal assistant, his instructions uncharacteristically terse and intense. The woman from the gala. The one who danced. I need to know about the dance. Not about her. About the dance itself. Find me the best. The absolute authorities on the tango. In the world. Bring them here. Money as always was no object. Within 48 hours his private jet had collected two revered figures from the world of competitive tango, an elderly, stern-faced Argentine maestro named Roberto and his partner, a sharp-eyed Italian woman named Sofia. They were ushered into his private screening room, a cold, minimalist space with a screen that dominated one wall. Khalid, dispensing with all pleasantries, played the cell phone video a guest had taken of Leila's performance. He watched them instead of the screen. Initially, their expressions were professionally neutral, perhaps expecting a clumsy amateur performance. But as the video progressed, their postures changed. Roberto leaned forward, his sternness melting into intense focus. Sofia's hands slowly rose to cover her mouth. When the video ended, the room was silent. Khalid finally spoke, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Well, it was adequate. Roberto turned to him, his eyes wide with something akin to reverence. Adequate? Senor Al-Fayed, that was not adequate. That was not even excellent. He took a deep breath. What you witnessed was tango de salon. Not for show. Not for competition. It is the social tango of the old milongas in Buenos Aires, but this was a rare form. It is called tango canyon. It is ancient from the very roots. The posture is lower, the embrace is closer, the steps are more intricate and, how do you say, earthbound. It is a conversation, not a performance. But the way she danced it alone, to tell such a story without a partner? He shook his head in sheer disbelief. Sofia nodded, her voice filled with excitement. It is the storytelling, yes. Did you see the corrida at the 2-minute mark? The quick, light running steps? That was not just a step. That was her mocking you. And the quebrada, the break in the rhythm followed by that sharp golpecito with her heel? That was anger. Pure, precise anger. And the way she used the lapis, the toe of her shoe tracing a circle on the floor before that final bolio. That is a signature. A calling card. I have only seen that specific, flawless execution in one place. She turned to her partner. Roberto, the academy in Naples. The one run by the Conti woman. Elena. She was a champion in the 60s. She taught that precise lapis turn. She said it was like signing your name on the floor before you leave. Khalid felt a strange, cold thrill run through him. A name. A place. A lineage. He had a thread to pull. He dismissed the experts with a generous payment that felt, for the first time, like an insult for the priceless knowledge they had given him. He didn't send an assistant. He didn't make a call. Driven by a compulsion he could not name, he boarded his jet to Naples. He found the small, unassuming dance academy tucked away on a quiet side street, its windows fogged with condensation, the sound of an accordion drifting from within. He entered not as a billionaire but as a penitent seeking answers. An elderly woman with fierce, intelligent eyes and her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, Elena, greeted him. He lied poorly, saying he was a researcher, an enthusiast who had seen a video of a dancer with a unique style and was desperate to learn its origins. Elena, warmed by his apparent passion, spoke without suspicion. "Ah, you have a good eye," she said, her voice still bearing the melodic traces of her Italian heritage. "That style, that soul, that is my teaching. But the soul itself? That belongs to my granddaughter." Her face softened with a pride that was palpable and utterly genuine. "Leila. She doesn't dance for crowds. She doesn't dance for trophies, though she could win them all. She dances like she breathes. With her entire heart. She feels the story in the music and she lets it move through her. It is a gift, but it is also her truth. She works a simple job, you know? She says it keeps her feet on the ground. That her art is not for sale. It is for living." She smiled a little sadly. "She says the most beautiful tangos are the ones danced for no one but yourself." Khalid stood in the small, warm studio, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 dances, and felt the final crushing weight of realization settle upon him. He hadn't just insulted a server. He had taken the deepest truth of an artist's soul, the legacy of a grandmother's love, the discipline of a lifetime, and he had tried to buy it for the price of a cheap joke. The words, "I'll marry you," echoed in his mind not as a boast, but as the most pathetic and hollow sentiment he had ever uttered. He had seen the treasure, and in his arrogance, he had mistaken it for trinkets. He thanked Elena, his voice thick with an emotion he could not express, and walked back out into the narrow street, a billionaire who had never felt poorer in his life. The flight back from Naples to Dubai was a journey through a profound and unsettling interior landscape for Khalid. The plush leather of his private jet seat, which usually cradled him in isolated comfort, now felt like a confessional booth. He stared out the window at the endless blanket of clouds below, but he wasn't seeing the weather patterns or the geographic features they passed over. He was seeing the fierce, proud eyes of Elena as she spoke of her granddaughter. He was hearing the quiet, reverent analysis of the tango masters. And overlaying it all was the memory of Leila's face, not in anger or fear, but in that moment of serene, absolute focus just before she began to dance. The look of an artist connecting with a truth he could not even comprehend. For the first time in his life, Khalid Al-Fayed was engaged in a brutal, unvarnished audit of his own soul, and the ledger was catastrophically in the red. The arrogance of his proposition at the gala, which had felt like a display of power at the time, now revealed itself as the pinnacle of his own ignorance. He had walked through the world seeing people as functions, as utilities. Staff were there to serve. Business associates were there to deal. Women were there to adorn or amuse. He had never once paused to consider that the quiet woman refilling his glass might be the vessel for a generations-old artistic tradition, that her hands, which he had only seen holding a tray, were capable of expressing a language of emotion so potent it could silence a room of jaded socialites. He had tried to price a masterpiece using the crude calculus of the marketplace, and in doing so had only succeeded in pricing his own character and found it to be worthless. The jet touched down on his private runway, the smooth deceleration a stark contrast to the turbulent storm raging in his mind. He did not go to his office. He did not check his messages. He went directly to the one place he had avoided since the gala, the palatial home of his father, Mr. Abbas. The house was a monument to disciplined success, quiet and orderly, a reflection of the man himself. Khalid found his father in his study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books, reviewing a contract. Mr. Abbas looked up, his sharp eyes taking in his son's disheveled appearance, the unusual lack of swagger in his posture. "Khalid," he said, his voice neutral. "I heard about the incident at the gala. The gossip was colorful." Khalid did not sit. He stood before his father's large mahogany desk like a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office, but the feeling was one of his own making, not his father's. The words began to tumble out of him, not in his usual confident tone, but in a rushed, confessional torrent. He told him everything. Not the sanitized, boastful version his friends had likely heard, but the truth. He described his boredom, his cruel proposition, the exact words he had used. He described the dance not as a performance, but as the devastating emotional dissection it had been. He told him about his quest for the Tango masters, their analysis, and finally, his trip to Naples and the meeting with Elena. "I found her grandmother," he finished, his voice hollow. "I sat in her studio and I lied to her, and she spoke of her granddaughter with a pride I have never given you a reason to feel." He expected anger. A lecture on decorum, on the responsibilities of their name, on the perils of public scandal. He braced for it. But Mr. Abbas simply listened, his expression growing gradually more grave, more thoughtful. When Khalid finally fell silent, spent, his father leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The silence stretched for a long moment. "You thought your money and your name were a magnet that attracted respect," Mr. Abbas said finally, his voice low and measured, devoid of anger but filled with a crushing weight of disappointment. "You were wrong. They are a magnet, yes. But they attract fear. They attract avarice. They attract sycophants who will laugh at your cruel jokes and tell you they are clever. You have surrounded yourself with the reflection of your wealth, Khalid, and you have mistaken it for the reflection of your character." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Respect is not attracted. It is earned. It is earned through integrity, through humility, through understanding that every person you meet has a universe inside them that your money cannot map and your power cannot command." He stood up and walked around the desk to stand before his son. He did not offer comfort. He offered a challenge. "You have spent your life using wealth as a weapon to get what you want. Now you must use it as a tool to make right what you have broken. This is not about giving her money. That would be the final, greatest insult. This is about demonstrating that you have listened, that you have learned. You must make this right not as Khalid al-Fayed, the billionaire, but as Khalid, the man who finally understands how little that title is worth." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture unexpectedly firm. "The choice is yours. You can return to your parties and forget this ever happened. Or you can go to her and prove to her, and to yourself, that you are capable of more than just writing a check. That you are capable of growth." He paused, letting the choice hang in the air, immense and defining. "So, my son, what will you now become?" The address for Elena's dance academy was seared into Khalid's memory, a humble coordinate on a map that now represented the most important destination of his life. This time he did not arrive by private jet or in a chauffeured limousine that screamed of wealth and distance. He took a commercial flight, sitting among everyday travelers, and from the airport he hired a simple, unremarkable car. The act of navigating the chaotic streets of Naples himself, without a buffer of staff and privilege, felt strangely appropriate, a small, necessary penance. He parked a block away from the academy and walked the rest of the distance, the sounds of the city a stark contrast to the insulated silence of his penthouse. He wore simple, dark clothes, wanting to offer not the image of a billionaire, but the silhouette of just a man. He stood for a moment outside the familiar door, hearing the faint, haunting strains of a bandoneon from within. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with the confidence of a deal-maker, but with the terrifying vulnerability of someone about to offer up a piece of their soul for judgment. He pushed the door open. The scene inside was as before, the warm, slightly dusty studio, the elderly Elena coaching a young student. And there, in the corner, practicing a subtle footwork pattern alone in front of a mirror, was Leila. She wore leggings and a simple top, her hair tied back. She was immersed in her art, her expression one of focused concentration. She was, in this element, utterly and completely herself. Elena noticed him first, her eyes widening in surprise and a flicker of protective suspicion. The young student stopped dancing. Leila, sensing the shift in the room's energy, turned from the mirror. When she saw him, her whole body went still. The focused expression didn't change into anger or fear. It simply became a guarded, waiting stillness. She said nothing. She just watched him, waiting for him to speak, to define this intrusion. Khalid did not move from his spot just inside the doorway. He felt the weight of their gazes, of Elena's suspicion and Leila's silent judgment. He had rehearsed a speech on the plane, a grand, eloquent apology, but now, standing in the presence of the truth he had so carelessly mocked, all those prepared words evaporated, leaving only the raw, unvarnished facts. He looked directly at Leila, his hands hanging empty at his sides. "I have no excuse," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of all its former arrogance. There is no justification for what I did. My behavior at the gala was cruel, ignorant, and small. He swallowed, forcing himself to hold her gaze, to not look away from the discomfort of his own shame. I came here to Naples before. I lied to your grandmother. I said I was a researcher because I was too ashamed to tell her who I was and what I had done. She spoke to me about you. She told me that you dance with your soul, not for an audience. She told me your art is not for sale. It is for living. He took a slow, shaky breath. I thought my money defined my worth. Your dance, what you did, it showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that real value is here, he said, his voice cracking slightly as he brought a closed fist to his own heart. And here. He touched his temple. You were not the entertainment that night. I was. And the performance was a tragedy of my own making. I'm sorry. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I understand now the profound depth of my disrespect towards you and towards your art. I'm sorry for the weight of my words. I will feel their weight for a very long time. He finished. There was no offer of money. No grand gesture. Just a man standing in a dusty dance studio, offering the only thing he had left that was of any value, a naked and unreserved apology. The silence that followed was different from the ballroom's silence. This was not awe, it was assessment. Leila studied him, her eyes searching his face for any trace of the smirk, the calculation, the arrogance. She saw only a weary sincerity and the clear evidence of a struggle she had ignited within him. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a single, slow nod. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was an acknowledgement. She had heard him. Elena, watching the exchange, gave a barely perceptible nod of her own, a silent verdict that he had passed the first, most important test. My grandmother's academy, Leila said, her voice even without malice. It needs a new roof. The floor needs to be refinished. There are students who can't afford the lessons. She wasn't asking him. She was presenting him with a fact, and in doing so, offering him a path, not to buy her forgiveness, but to apply his resources in a way that respected her world, that honored her art. It would be my honor, Khalid said, the words feeling truer than any he had ever spoken, to ensure that this place continues to teach dancers to speak with their souls. It was a beginning, not an end. A first, small, humble step on a much longer road. If you found yourself moved by this journey from arrogance to humility, by the power of truth to silence a crowded room, then you understand that the most compelling stories are often those that resonate with our own capacity for growth. To ensure you never miss a story that challenges the heart and inspires reflection, take a moment to subscribe. A world of meaningful narratives awaits, each one a reminder that the most valuable transformations often begin with a single, honest step.